Thanks for joining today's session, and it's really nice to have you here today. My name is Patrick. I'm a threat researcher at VMRay Labs, and for today's session, I will be your session host and also the speaker. I would like to start off with some housekeeping notes. We will have a short Q&A at the end of today's session, which will take approximately 25 to 30 minutes. So whenever you have any questions, feel free to take note of them and raise them directly after the session, or you can also use the chat to type them directly. And once we are done, we will just walk through them and answer them. Yeah, with that being said, we will directly jump into today's topic, which is about busy bees, the transformation of Bumblebee. And as mentioned before, within the upcoming 25 or 30 minutes, we would like to share with you some of the insights that we got throughout the past year while looking at Bumblebee. So I'm certainly sure that most of the people joining this session today have already heard about Bumblebee before, because throughout the past year, it has been quite often mentioned in security-related news. I have just selected a couple of them here to show this to you. Some keywords, some highlights we have here: Bumblebee increasing its capacities and TDPs, Bumblebee Loader, the high road to enterprise domain control, which sounds already pretty scary. We have the dark side of Bumblebee Malware Loader. It returns with new infection techniques, and there's a DocuSign campaign and so on and so forth. So throughout the past year, there were lots of different news where you could read about something of Bumblebee. I think one very interesting headline here is a new loader rapidly assuming central position in cybersecurity or in cybercrime ecosystem, which already gives kind of an introduction of what's happening here. So Bumblebee seems to be a new loader, which actually gets quite fast popular. And this is something that we would like to cover today. We will dive a bit into what we have seen, what has been changed throughout this year, and where actually Bumblebee has been involved in certain attacks. But to start off with that whole topic, I would like to bring everyone on the same page. So we are talking about Bumblebee, which is a malware family that's been active since March 2022. So right now it's a bit more than a year. Very interestingly, it seems to be a successor to a family which is called Buzzer Loader, which is also a well-known loader. And there is a bit of a relation between Bumblebee and Buzzer Loader. At a point where Bumblebee appeared back in March 2022, Buzzer Loader, interestingly, completely stopped its operation. So when Bumblebee appeared, there are actually no new Buzzer Loader samples anymore, and everything seems to have stopped, which is also like a bit the assumption why Bumblebee seems to be a successor to Buzzer Loader. Also, very interesting fact about Bumblebee is that it obviously mainly acts as a loader for other malware families, for other payloads, but it also started to act as a bot at a certain point throughout the last year. But we will cover this in more detail a bit later. What is very interesting about Bumblebee, or what are actually some characteristics about Bumblebee? First of all, it uses a very unique and customized packer. So a packer, you can consider a packer as a black box. You can put in a payload into a packer. You get some obfuscated and encrypted data out, which is actually should bypass signature-based detections and AVs, for example. Bumblebee also makes use of a very interesting and clever hooking technique, which isn't new, but it's still interesting that we can see this again in Bumblebee, which we will cover a bit later. And it also makes use of a huge number of different evasion techniques, which we will dive into in this session today. All of these things being said, it really looks like Bumblebee is pretty new, and it's a pretty interesting target. And it also seems to still try and evolve itself because there is active development going on. And this is also something that we will cover within the upcoming 25 to 30 minutes. But first of all, we've mentioned before in this keywords for these headlines that we have seen in news throughout the past year, that Bumblebee could be used to actually get domain or actually reach the domain level of within a business environment. So there is actually an activity, and Bumblebee is used in downloading additional payloads. And most of those payloads are actually post-exploitation tools. So throughout the past year, we have seen that it's very commonly for Bumblebee that's further downloading a MetaPredator shellcode, Covert Strike or Sliver as post-exploitation tools before finally also deploying ransomware. So from an attack point of view, it really looks like they try to start off getting access to an environment. Once they have access, they use some post-exploitation tools in order to do some lateral movement, try to look a bit around through the environment, what is happening there, what are we actually targeting and attacking. Then they maybe also try to start collecting and stealing some kind of data before deploying ransomware to cause some damage and impact for business environments. So it's definitely something that you would watch out for and definitely don't want to have it in your environment. From a very brief look into the VMRay attack overview to see some tactics and some techniques that threat actors behind Bumblebee make use of. This is an excerpt of the VMRay Analyzer, a VMRay platform report. And I think the middle columns, the defense evasion part and also the discovery part is actually the most important and the most relevant here. We actually see that there is techniques for trying to detect virtualization and sandboxes. But we also see that there are other things happening like query registry keys, trying to enumerate processes, trying to enumerate files and directories. While some of those seems to actually related to maybe also like get some information, maybe collecting some information, the main idea behind this discovery approach for Bumblebee is actually trying to determine if it's running in a virtualized environment or even in a sandbox. If this is the case, Bumblebee definitely wants to stop its execution to prevent detection, which is most likely a legitimate behavior from like the threat actor's point of view because they don't want to have detection on it. They actually trying to operate as long as possible somewhere hidden. And in VMRay platform, you can actually see that this behavior is already captured via our VMRay threat identifiers. And this is also mapped into the VMRay attack overview. So we have already a very brief overview of what is happening, which kind of techniques and tactics Bumblebee is actually using. But we will dive into some of them a bit more later on. First of all, the most important and also interesting part to know is how is Bumblebee even delivered and how it can reach your environment. As usually, there is like, for most cases, a malicious email, which uses a delivery chain. And in the end, we have the execution of Bumblebee. And this way is very interesting because you have already a couple of different points where you can start block and detect certain threats. So I would like to walk a bit through this. But first of all, before starting with that, I would like to mention one very impactful decision that happened last year. I think it was around the middle of 2022, where Microsoft decided to disable or block the execution of Office macros by default if they are actually coming from an untrusted source. So everything that happened before, I'd like to call the macro-based delivery world. I think pretty much each attack made use of macro-based documents because it was very easy and it worked pretty well from a threat actor's point of view. And Microsoft decided to block this by default, which caused a huge, which was an impactful decision and caused the threat actors to start rethinking their process. How can we actually achieve delivering a payload without making use of Office documents with macros? So they had to start think a bit out of the box. They had to start think around the corner to find some additional ways on how they still could deliver payloads without making use of Office documents. I would say even though we still see Office documents, they are definitely not that common anymore. And since then, a lot of things have changed. Right now, we are living in a post-macro world in the end, and we see lots of different delivery chains. And in this case, I would like to explicitly talk about Bumblebee and what we have seen so far. So first of all, Bumblebee started off with having an email that either contained a direct link or an HTML file as an attachment. The direct link is pretty obvious. If you click it, you open a browser and a file download starts automatically. If you open this HTML attachment, it most likely also gets opened in a browser. Also, a file download started automatically. In this case, the attackers made use of a technique which is called HTML smuggling. That means that the final payload that they would download to this system that they want to infect to is already directly embedded in the HTML file. And just when you open it, it starts automatically the download process. Commonly, the downloaded files were either the regular archives or password-protected archives. So once downloaded, the user had to follow this downloaded file, extract the archive, or even take the password for the archive from this HTML file and then extract it, which mostly lead to an unpacked ISO file. There were also different disk image files being involved, like VHD or VHDX, but the most common ones actually were ISO files. Modern versions of Windows make use of a default extension handler for such ISO files. So you can just double-click it, it gets mounted, and you can see it in Windows Explorer. Once mounted, the user had to still follow this mounted folder. Then there was mostly an LNK file embedded into this folder. Once clicked, it automatically executes some scripts that are also hidden in a directory within this ISO file. So this is one of these delivery chains that we have observed with Bumblebee. We would consider this as a quite complex one because there are lots of different steps required from the user to actually get infected with in this case, Bumblebee. Even though it sounds pretty complex, and I personally was actually pretty surprised that this whole chain worked because there are lots of different steps. Users typically tend to click on wherever they can click, and they also typically tend to click on wherever the threat actor says, please open that file or please click on that. So this seems to work pretty fine. In early 2023, we have seen something different. There was a huge hype about OneNote documents. OneNote is just a regular Office application that's also being installed on, I think, most of the modern Windows versions by default, actually. But it never really has been used in any kind of attacks before. So in early 2023, someone was pretty clever and thought, okay, well, maybe there's a way how we can make this complex delivery chain less complex. And they probably have played around a bit, did some research on that, and they maybe came across OneNote documents. And OneNote has a nice feature because you can attach attachments to it. So you can just directly drag and drop something into the document. Depending on the file type, it either gets just downloaded when you click it or it gets executed. So in this case, attackers started to attach either ISO files, archives, or Windows-based scripting files directly to the OneNote document. And once clicked, if it's a scripting file, it's getting automatically being executed, which already leads to the execution of Bumblebee. If it's another file, it's probably getting dropped to the disk, and you have still continue this kind of complex delivery chain where you have to click through the steps that they want you to click to. And as mentioned before, also OneNote documents mostly used some kind of images with a button looking like text there, which says either download document or click to view. And this is where users typically also tend to click on it. If the threat actor says, please click to view the document here, users typically do that. And I think one of the most recent changes that we have seen is the use of PDF documents, which seems to be pretty simple in the end compared to this complex delivery chain, which involves ISO files, LNK files, and other Windows scripting files. Right now, we do frequently see PDF documents, which also contain just an image saying, well, to view the document, please click download. And in the end, clicking download also leads to downloading a Windows scripting file. It could either be a WSF file, a JScript, VB script, something where Windows has a default extension handler for, which then also finally executes the payload. And last but not least, there is also a completely different approach that we have observed. There were like MSI-based installers, which you can pretty much customize with adding a PowerShell script, and threat actors also make use of this. So they either completely created a fake installer, or they hijacked or backdoored existing installers with some customized PowerShell code in order to download or unpack and execute the final payload. Once the payload has been executed, at least some of the samples of Bumblebee make use of this interesting hooking-based loading technique, which actually just fake loads the malicious DLL via a low-level API call, which is called LDR load DLL. The whole idea of this hooking-based loading approach is actually to bypass EDR systems. In order to do that, they try to actually fake load a malicious DLL in form of, or in the context of, a trusted Windows DLL, which seems to work pretty well, I think. This technique, as mentioned, is not new. It's already pretty known. There were other malware families in the past that also make use of that technique. So it's also somehow pretty interesting that we see this again in Bumblebee. So either they like share developers, they share code, or they just found this technique interesting, analyzed it, and rebuilt them by themselves. So how is this whole loading approach working? Actually, it's pretty simple. Before or during the execution of Bumblebee, the process of Bumblebee tries to find a not loaded system DLL of Windows. They mostly have 3 different DLLs being they are searching for. It's this DIMS ROM, the SPE, or the WPS DLL. All of them are legitimate Windows DLLs, and they are also typically not loaded into a process. In this case, for example, DIMS ROM should not be loaded, and if it's not loaded, then they start hooking some low-level API calls, which in the end are being required or being used by the LDR load DLL API. To have some names here, it's mostly well-known API calls. It's map view of section, is open section, it's create section. So well-known API calls that are mostly also related to injection, and this is also what they are starting to hook here. Hooking means that they just try to override the original entry point of that API, pointing to their own code, that they can execute also their own code before finally executing the actual API. And what they then do is, once the hook has been applied, they call the low-level API function with, for example, this DIMS ROM.dll as an argument. So the whole idea would be to load DIMS ROM DLL, and typically AVs, for example, saying, well, the process is trying to load a legitimate DLL, so there is probably nothing suspicious, nothing wrong going on here. So also probably no need to scan or to further scan anything. However, due to the applied hooks, instead of really loading that DLL that Windows and also the AV might think this process is loading, they start loading the malicious payload, the malicious DLL within this context of the before mentioned DLL. This is the overall a quick overview of this technique, how this hooking-based loader works, and it's very interesting because, as mentioned before, it has already been seen and been used in the past, but this time it's also again present in Bumblebee. So seems to be some reusage of that code. While we actually can already consider this hooking-based loading approach as an evasion technique for specific AVs that probably rely on hooking, or also for sandbox that rely on hooking, there are actually even more evasion techniques. Overall, Bumblebee implements approximately 50 different evasion techniques, whereas nearly all of them focus to detect virtualization environments like VirtualBox, VMware, Parallels, KVM, QEMU, so all known vendors. Besides trying to detect virtualization environments, they also have additional checks like mouse movements, memory, so everything that you could like maybe use to detect a sandbox. The most interesting part about Bumblebee is that the developers seem to be very lazy. They might come across the point where they mentioned, well, we want to try to operate as long as possible without getting detected, and lots of security operations centers and also other departments and companies might make use of sandboxes. it might make sense to try detect the sandbox, and if we run in a sandbox, we just stop the execution, which could prevent detection, right? So there's a lot and lots of different things you have to consider when you try to come up with ideas. How can you detect the sandbox? Well, I think the developer of Bumblebee might be very lazy at that point. So they thought, well, let's do research. They might have seen, well, there are already existing approaches and existing techniques available. So why should we spend lots of time into developing our own techniques if there are already existing ones? So what they at the end did, they just went ahead, they got the open source project, which is called Alcacer from GitHub. I guess you probably know it. It's a collection of techniques that you can use to detect virtualized environments and sandboxes. In the end, it's a tool to stress test sandboxes. This tool contains a collection of techniques that has already been used in the past by malicious files, but it also contains some more theoretical ideas on how you could detect a certain sandbox. So they went ahead, they just took that code and put it into their own code. And in the end, that's it. So it's most likely copy-paste, less effort, but I think pretty good idea. So they just have lots of those additional checks implemented there. And even though I think most of those checks are not complex and not that advanced, it's still something that when you consider analyzing such a file, either manually or automated, you have to take care of, because you have to ensure that Bumblebee isn't detecting your environment. While, for example, VMRay platform can be used to bypass all of these techniques, and the analysis works completely fine. If you want to do this manually on a VM because you want to debug Bumblebee or you want to take a closer look into it, you have to ensure that you consider this kind of techniques, that you patch them, that you bypass them. So it's just like they're adding some additional overhead from the security point of view to get around this evasion techniques. Taking a look at the timeline over the past year, initially when Bumblebee appeared in March 2022, we haven't seen any kind of evasion check or evasion techniques implemented in the Bumblebee samples. So it was completely empty, just like a program you executed, it's running fine, which led a bit to the assumption that this might be a testing phase where they try to test their own development. If the program works fine, if the loader works fine, that could be one of the reasons why we haven't seen any evasion techniques at that point. Just a couple of weeks later, in May 2022, we have seen new samples that have approximately 35 evasion techniques being implemented. The interesting part here is that all of those implemented techniques were pretty much just really copied and pasted into their own code. So they were completely matching or pretty much matching with the ones that you can find in the open source GitHub project. A couple of months later, in November 22, for any reason that's pretty much unknown, I would say, we have seen new samples again without any evasion techniques being implemented again. So for any reason, all of those checks have been removed. While a couple of weeks later, in January 2023, new samples appeared again with an increased number of evasion techniques. In this case, it were a bit more than 50 evasion techniques. So it could be the case, that's pretty much our assumption or our guessing in the end, that in November, they actually started to prepare for an update, which happened then in January, where they just removed those evasion techniques because they maybe were just in the middle of development phase, in the middle of development process, but they still wanted to make use of some of those samples. So that could be one guess why at that point we haven't seen any kind of evasion techniques anymore. However, meanwhile, they are present there again. The difference between middle of 2022 and early 2023, earlier samples only used or only had implemented the small number of checks which mainly focused to detect VirtualBox, parallels, QEMU, and KVM, besides some other more generic checks for registry keys, MAC addresses. So the main focus was really to detect the virtualized environment in the end. Comparing this with the samples from early 2023, they have added VMware-related artifact checks. So they also extended the virtualization detection for VMware. But then they also added explicit checks that could be used to actually detect the sandbox. So not only focusing on the virtualization anymore, but also on trying to detect the sandbox itself via mouse movements, the file names of the submitted sample, disk size, running services, CPU fans, and so on and so forth. So lots of different checks that really focus on detecting the sandbox as well. One interesting side effect here is also that compared to older samples where they really took the code one-to-one via copy and paste probably, the latest samples that we've seen in 2023 actually made use of some more modified functions. So it's not a copy-paste anymore. They actually really started to also adjust those functions by themselves. Well, once the sample has been executed and you have bypassed all of the different evasion techniques, there's also a communication to the command and control server expected. In this case, as mentioned earlier, Bumblebee is actually a loader, or it initially started out as a loader. So there are common commands where you can use for shellcode injection, DLL injection, download and execute. So those three are probably the most relevant ones for a loader. You could actually apply payloads in different forms. Could be shellcode, could be a DLL, but it also could be a regular executable in the end. There's also one interesting command which can be used to actually uninstall Bumblebee from an infected machine. We are not certainly sure what this is used for in the end. I most likely think that if a threat actor gets access to a system, they probably don't want to remove the access again, unless they might infect themselves maybe, but that's also just a random guess in the end. There's also another C2 command that can be used to make persistence, so to have access across reboots. Also one for executing shellcode commands and load plugins. But I think the more interesting part here is again to look into the timeline, so when happened what. And as mentioned before, Bumblebee initially started as a loader. So there were those three important C2 commands for shellcode injection, DLL injection, download and execute. In May 2022, when they started to also add additional evasion techniques, or actually evasion techniques, they added a new shellcode or a new command for shellcode execution, or shell command execution in the end, which actually leads to that point where Bumblebee also moved from acting as a pure loader into also acting a bit as a bot, because in the end, executing shell commands could be used for everything. You can execute arbitrary commands there. So it's actually starting to act as a bot as well. And in August 2022, which is pretty much unrelated to the updates of additional evasion techniques, they added a new command for loading additional plugins. And finally, one of the last points here is if you want to hunt and if you want to try to protect an environment for infections with Bumblebee, it's also pretty important to be aware of the embedded configuration, for example, where Bumblebee reaches out to its C2 server. This can be used to actually generate high-quality IOCs that you can use to proactively block on your environment or also hunt for probably potentially infected systems already. Bumblebee actually makes use of a very simple configuration. So first of all, it's just RC4 encrypted, but this also only applies for the majority of the samples, whereas the earliest ones that we have seen in March 2022 didn't have any kind of encryption being applied. So the configuration was just there in plain text. Then you also need an encryption key, obviously, to decrypt the configuration. There is an identifier, which is pretty much an unknown value because it's not used within the execution of Bumblebee. We have the mission ID that could be related to the campaign, and we also have C2 addresses. While older sample of Bumblebees without the RC4 encryption of the configuration only had one single C2 address, newer ones have multiple of them, whereas the majority of those addresses are actually decoy domains or decoy IPs in the end. Decoy IPs means that it's just a totally legitimate IP address that's pointing to a legitimate service or server, and they just try to hide the actual command and control server address within these decoy addresses. If you have all of this information and you can just extract the data, you can also extract the key. You can just start and go ahead and decrypt this configuration. You can get the IP addresses, which you can either get the decoy addresses and the actual C2 address. And you can use both of them for threat hunting, hunting in an environment, or at least the malicious one to start blocking them. VMRay platform also provides the capability here with the feature malware configuration extraction. So even if we find a Bumblebee sample and you execute it, VMRay is able to extract this configuration out of the memory dumps and provides the data in a JSON format, so it's easy to further process in the end. Well, that's most of it. So let's get to some takeaways. I think it's very easy to see that Bumblebee had, at least over the past year, some major code changes. So they added some evasion techniques, they removed some evasion techniques, they added some again. They also played around with C2 commands that Bumblebee can support. All of this leads to the conclusion that Bumblebee is currently still active, being actively developed. So someone is really sitting behind there, trying to improve Bumblebee, trying to make it more powerful, just trying to get it more popular. And that also means that we would expect that the number of Bumblebee samples will still increase in the future because they are actively working on it. Even though it wasn't the most active family in the past, it's still active and it's still like causing damage and potential risks for companies, especially considering that it has been used in high-profile attacks where they reached administration privileges of the whole domain, and they also deployed ransomware there. One thing that I would like to mention at the end here is this is an excerpt of some Bumblebee samples that we have collected over the past, I think it's most likely 30 or 45 days. And one very interesting highlight here is that you can see there's one current campaign ongoing for Bumblebee, and there are not that less samples per day. So even though the overall number of samples decreased a bit over the past weeks, they're still expected to come more. And if this campaign probably will be shut down, there might be another one again popping up in the future. So it's still definitely something that you would like to watch out for and that we would like to prevent your environment from. With that being said, we are pretty much done with the actual content. If there are any questions, then please feel free to raise them directly or in the chat. If not, then I would like to thank all of you for your time, and I would like to thank you for joining the session today. If you have any further questions about VMRay, please feel free to reach out to someone from us via vmray.com. Thank you very much.